Hey, Wayne Fox. I've had a few people ask if I would do a video recording how I process an image from the beginning to the end. The other day I tried that, and after about 10 minutes of video realized how long the video would be, and if I tried to condense it down and make it meaningful, how much time that would take and how useless it would probably be. I had the idea that maybe what I could do is take an image and in Lightroom just step through each step one at a time, discuss why I did each step when I did it, and you can see the result of each step as I step through them. And I thought maybe at least that would be a little bit informative. So let's give that a try. So the first image I thought I would try this with is this image I took in Portland, Oregon, a rather famous tree. Most landscape photographers have seen images of this tree, and many have gone to take images of this tree or have it on their bucket list. This particular image is entitled Autumn's Grace. It's part of my Marcia Fox memorial collection that I do each year. I take one image and I put it up for sale, and all profits go to the MS Society and in memory of my wife. I have been to this location 4 times now, and I've managed to get nice images on 2 of those. It's a little difficult timing the trip because, you know, fall doesn't really occur on a regular basis. The color on this tree can vary as much as 2 to 3 weeks. But this last time I went, I got one of my better images, and I really like how this one turned out. So let's just take this image and go through it and talk about each step and how I ended up with this particular version. So here is the image as it was imported into Lightroom. This is taken with a IQ 3100 phase 1 digital back on a phase 1 body. I believe I used my 28mm lens on this. No, this is my LS 40 to 80 lens. The image is a little underexposed, and I did that on purpose. I didn't want to crank the ISO up any higher than I had it. I usually try to keep it as absolutely low as possible, and I'd rather shoot it just a little thin like this. That's thin's a word that comes from film days, but a little underexposed, because the current CMOS sensors are so good about low noise and shadows. As long as I didn't have any really dark blacks, I wasn't too worried. So the first thing I typically do on an image is do a crop on it. Here you can see that I cropped it. I took the bottom off. Let's go to the crop rectangle here. And it looks like I cropped it overall, then I tweaked it a little bit more. And the reason I crop first is to make sure that I exclude any pixels that I don't intend on being in the final image in my histogram as I evaluate as I go along. One thing I might comment on briefly is aspect ratio. I believe the composition of the image should drive the aspect ratio, that I really don't want to be conforming to some predetermined aspect ratios that are popular. It's not that I don't use those sometimes, and in fact, there's a couple over here, and one that I specifically created myself, this 8x21. I came up with sort of mathematically on my own, although I think there's several that are very, very close to that. If it happens to be very close to one of these, I might go ahead and use one, but for the most part, a lot of my images end up with a custom aspect ratio, because I really think the composition should drive what you crop and how you crop. My normal process is probably to do exposure first, but in this case I must have decided to do shadows first. And I'm assuming I did that because as you look up in the histogram, the bulk of the images, I'll hover over the shadow slider, and the gray area highlighted there is the area of the image where the tones are going to be affected by that slider. And as you can see, that at least 50% of the pixels in this image fall within that range. So I was more worried about bringing the detail up in the shadows to kind of start with. I assume that's why I did it in that order. There's no real magic order. I just kind of look at an image and think, okay, what does it need next? And that's what I do. I adjust a little contrast, and one thing I almost always do is work with contrast and clarity together at first, because clarity is a form of contrast and it definitely affects it. A lot of people say to avoid clarity because it kind of weakens the colors. I think that's a phenomenon that only happens if you're viewing at the image as it's shrunk down. If you go to 100%, I don't think you'll see that. I've heard a few teachers say that. I don't think it's a real common teaching, but I definitely think the clarity slider is very important and useful. I added a little saturation and I cooled it down just a little bit. I'm probably looking at the tree trunk at this point because I've realized the trunk of this tree is going to play an important part of the composition, not just the graphical element of it, but the beautiful moss that's growing on it and the way the light is hitting that moss. I added a post-crop vignette here, and I almost always add this. The camera profiles nowadays remove all natural lens vignetting. Most lenses have a vignette effect which darkens the outside of an image, and so over the centuries of photography, most lenses have a little bit of a darkening to the outside, and it's a very normal thing, and we're taking that out is a good thing sometimes because at least you can take it out. But in this case, I wanted to add it back in and make sure the attention stayed more into the middle and into the trunk of the tree. I do it, most of my images have a little bit of post-crop vignette just to add back in that vignette that's been removed by the lens profile. I finally decided to tackle the exposure, and I brought it up considerably. And at this point, I probably decided that I'm liking what I'm getting, and it's an image worth pursuing. I'll typically work with an image for a few minutes and make a pretty quick judgment on whether I think it's worth investing any time in. I changed the tint a little here. I cranked in a little magenta, probably trying to see if I get those leaves to look a little more like the natural color that they are. And as I look at this now, I realize it's a little too pink. And as you'll see in a minute, I didn't take long to take most of that back out. Next, I add a graduated filter. And if I click over here on the graduated filter tool, I added this one down here. This is the adjustment that I made. Sorry, let's get rid of that overlay. This is the adjustment that I made here. Maybe we better go back and forth a couple times. So you can see that I just darkened that corner down a tiny bit. It was a negative 0.27. Added another graduated filter up at the top, and because I already had a value from the first graduated filter, you can see adding this graduated filter added the same value to it, and I decided it was about right. I didn't need to tweak it anymore. So it's also a negative 0.27. Add a little bit of vibrance, and then I added a little more clarity. And then here's where I took a lot of that magenta tint back out. And as soon as I clicked that tint, you probably thought, oh, wow, that's really green. That's kind of the phenomenon that your eyes have when you make a sudden change like that. But as you look at this image over time, the quote greenness disappears. And it printed up this beautiful, beautiful color. The next step I did was add some brushes, but unlike most brush strokes, it's not quite what you think. So I added this brush stroke here. Let's make sure we can see it. And as you can see, what I've done is I've taken a great big brush and I've just clicked, and I've used auto mask. And as I go through these steps, you'll see that there are more and more of the image. These red leaves keep getting added to this brush. And that's a fairly typical process that I do. I've actually got a complete video out on that. So basically what I'm really doing is kind of creating a mask to mask out these leaves. And now when I do this, these adjustments, now I'm only affecting those colors. And as you can see, I added a little saturation, and I did a little more saturation. So here I was at 29, then I went to 32, and it looks like I changed the temperature slightly. So I added a little bit of that pink back in, but I did it only to the leaves rather than to the entire image. Now at that point, I'm pretty well finished with what I'm going to do in Lightroom, but as with most of my images, I end up going over into Photoshop, and if I go back and forth between the finished image and the, let's go to F here, and back and forth between this image, you'll see some slight changes. The main thing I'm doing is getting rid of those hot spots in the trees at the top. I think some people might have a little problem with that because it seems kind of artificial. But my opinion is when I'm looking at this tree, because I'm close to it, my mind is ignoring those spots in the distance, and I'm pretty well just not paying any attention to them. But because it's an image, I have no choice. I'm forced to see them. I think there's a lot of landscape photographers doing some of this. I was happy to see that Charles Kramer, a photographer I have a great amount of respect for. I just love his work and I love what he does. And watching his videos over on Luminous Landscape, I was pleased to see that he does this once in a while. And if it's good enough for Charles, I guarantee you it's good enough for me. So anyway, this is the finished image. I really didn't do much in Photoshop except do that out. That was probably a pretty simple selection and then a content aware fill. Pretty easy to do in Photoshop now. This printed up really nice, and I'm excited to say I've been able to sell several of these. And this, as I said, is part of my Marcia Fox Memorial fundraiser in memory of my late wife. Well, if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the video, and if you do, I'll maybe try to make a few more. Thanks.